The trade station called Corvus Anchor sat at the edge of neutral space, a giant wheel of metal and glass turning slowly against the black. It was a place where many species met to trade, to repair their ships, and to rest before long journeys. Humans were common there too, though most other species still did not know much about them. Humans kept to themselves, worked hard, and rarely caused trouble. That was about to change. A human family had docked their cargo hauler, the Quiet Step, at Bay 11 that morning. The family was small: a mother named Elena, a father named Marcus, and their daughter Myra, who was 8 years old. With them traveled an older man named Dorian Voss, a retired logistics officer who now worked as an escort for civilian ships. He was quiet, always watching, and carried himself with the kind of calm that made people trust him without knowing why. The station required all incoming cargo to be inspected before it could be sold or transferred. This was normal. Officers checked crates, scanned manifests, and asked questions. Most inspections took 20 minutes and ended with a stamp of approval. The officer assigned to the Quiet Step that day was Vex Thren, a member of the Skarn Enforcement Corps. She was young for her rank, having been promoted quickly through family connections rather than earned respect. She did not like humans. She thought they were soft, slow, and beneath the attention of a proper warrior species. She had heard stories about human patience and human strength, but she believed these were just stories, exaggerations told by weaker species trying to seem important. When she boarded the Quiet Step, she was already in a foul mood. Her superior had scolded her that morning for a mistake on a previous inspection, and she wanted to prove herself. She began going through the cargo with unnecessary roughness, pushing crates aside, scanning items twice, 3 times, looking for any reason to cause delay. Marcus stood nearby, arms crossed, saying nothing. Elena stood near her daughter. Myra, curious as children often are, stepped forward to look at the scanning device Vex Thren was using. She had always liked machines. She reached out one small hand, not to touch the officer, but to look closer at the glowing screen. Vex Thren saw the movement from the corner of her eye. She spun around, already angry, and without thinking, she struck the child across the face with the back of her hand. Myra fell to the floor, stunned, a red mark forming on her cheek. For a moment, nobody moved. The station's cameras, always recording, captured every second of it clearly. Elena rushed to her daughter, kneeling beside her, checking her face with shaking hands. Marcus did not shout. He did not raise his voice. He simply stepped forward and stood between Vex Thren and his family, his eyes locked on the officer with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was calm. It was cold. It was the look of a man committing something to memory. Dorian Voss, who had been standing near the cargo bay entrance, walked forward slowly. He did not touch Vex Thren. He did not threaten her. He simply said in a quiet voice, "You should not have done that." Vex Thren laughed, though the laugh sounded uncertain even to her. "She touched my equipment. I was well within my rights to." "You struck a child," Dorian said. "That is all that matters now." He turned, helped Elena lift Myra gently from the floor, and the family walked out of the cargo bay without another word. Vex Thren stood alone, suddenly aware that something had shifted, though she could not say what. She told herself it did not matter. Humans were known for being overly emotional about small things. She finished her inspection, stamped the cargo as approved, and went about her day, already forgetting the incident. She did not know that station security had already flagged the footage. She did not know that within the hour, a copy of the recording had been sent through a dozen different channels, each one quiet, each one official, each one part of a system she had never heard of. Dorian Voss took Myra and her parents to the station's medical bay, though the child's injury was minor, more shock than harm. While a station doctor checked her over, Dorian stepped outside and made a call on a secure channel. He spoke for only a few minutes, his voice steady and businesslike, as though he were reporting a supply shortage rather than an assault on a child. "This is Voss, registration number 4421. I am filing a Class 1 incident report under the Ardennes Compact, Article 7. Location, Corvus Anchor, Docking Bay 11. Time, 0942 Station Time. Subject, minor age 8, struck by a uniformed officer of the Scarn Enforcement Corps during a lawful inspection. Full video evidence is attached. I am requesting formal processing. On the other end of the call, a woman's voice answered, calm and unhurried. Copy that, Voss. Report received. Processing has begun. That was all. No alarm. No shouting. Just quiet acknowledgement, as though this kind of thing happened often enough to have a smooth procedure already in place. In truth, it rarely happened at all because very few people were foolish enough to harm a human child. But the system existed, old and patient, built decades ago and rarely needed. Word of the report did not spread quickly through the station. There was no announcement, no warning given to Vex Thren or her superiors. To anyone watching, nothing seemed different. The quiet step remained docked. The family stayed in their quarters. Dorian Voss went about his business as though nothing unusual had happened. But far away, in places most people on Corvus Anchor never thought about, something had begun to move. A human trade envoy stationed 2 systems away received a coded message and immediately canceled a scheduled meeting, citing urgent logistics matters. A cargo route that had been planned for the following week was quietly rerouted. A maintenance crew on a human vessel 3 days out began running diagnostics on systems that had not been used in months. None of these actions seemed connected to anyone watching. None of them raised alarms. They were small, boring, bureaucratic movements, the kind that no one paid attention to. That was the point. Back on Corvus Anchor, Vex Thren finished her shift and returned to her quarters, still telling herself the incident had been nothing. She reported it briefly to her superior, framing it as a minor disciplinary matter, a child who had not respected boundaries. Her superior nodded, barely listening, and told her to be more careful next time. That was the end of it, as far as either of them believed. Neither of them noticed that the station's official incident log now had a small, quiet flag attached to Vex Thren's file, a flag that had been placed not by station security, but by an external system neither of them had access to. Neither of them noticed that somewhere, in a place far from Corvus Anchor, a decision was already being made. Myra, meanwhile, sat in the family's quarters that evening, holding a cup of warm tea her mother had made her, the mark on her cheek already fatting. She did not fully understand what had happened, only that a stranger had hurt her and that her parents had been very quiet and very serious afterward. She asked her father if she was in trouble. No, Marcus said, kneeling beside her chair. You did nothing wrong. Then why does everyone seem upset? Marcus was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes, he said, when something like this happens, there are people whose job it is to make sure it never happens again. That's all. You don't need to worry about it. Myra nodded, though she did not fully understand. She finished her tea and went to bed early, tired from the long day. She had no way of knowing that her name had already been entered into old, careful records, or that a chain of events had begun that would eventually reach the highest levels of galactic government. She was simply a child who wanted to feel safe again, and by the next morning, her parents intended to make sure that safety was never in question again. Outside on the vast dark wheel of Corvus Anchor, life continued as normal. Traders traded, officers patrolled, ships came and went. Nobody looked twice at the quiet human family in Bay 11, or at the old man who stood near their ship like a silent guard. Nobody yet understood what had truly been set in motion. 3 days passed on Corvus Anchor before anyone outside the human family noticed anything unusual. The station continued its normal rhythm of trade and repair, and Vex Thren continued her duties, inspecting cargo, filing reports, and complaining to her fellow officers about how soft and sensitive humans were. She mentioned the incident with the child only once more, in passing, to a colleague named Dask, who barely looked up from his console. She grabbed at my equipment, Vexthren said. I barely touched her. You would think I had committed a war crime, the way her father looked at me. Dask shrugged. Humans are strange about their young. I heard they do not even allow their children to work until a certain age. Very inefficient. Exactly, Vexthren said, feeling justified. She did not notice that Dask did not fully agree with her, or that he had already heard a quiet rumor from a friend in station security about a flagged file. He said nothing about it. It was not his business, and rumors on a trade station were common and usually meant nothing. Far from Corvus Anchor, in offices and command centers scattered across human-controlled space, the report filed by Dorian Voss had already been processed through several layers of a system built long ago. Most alien species did not know this system existed, because it was rarely used and almost never spoken of. It had been created decades earlier, during the early years when humanity first joined the wider galactic community, when human diplomats sat through long negotiations with older, more established species who saw humans as a curious but minor addition to galactic affairs. During those negotiations, humanity had asked for very little. They did not demand territory. They did not demand special trade privileges. They asked for only one thing above all others, a set of binding compacts that guaranteed protection for human children, no matter where those children traveled in the galaxy. Other species found this request strange, even amusing. Many of their own cultures had different, looser views on the treatment of the young. Some species did not raise their offspring at all, leaving them to grow independently from birth. To them, humanity's insistence seemed sentimental, even old-fashioned. But humanity was patient during those negotiations and firm. They offered valuable trade agreements in exchange, technology sharing, and cooperation on projects other species wanted badly. Eventually, tired of arguing over what seemed like a minor issue, the Council agreed. The compacts were signed, filed away, and mostly forgotten. Nobody expected them to matter much. Humans, after all, were not known for causing trouble. The compact Dorian Voss had invoked was called the Ardennes Compact, named after a human diplomat who had pushed hardest for its creation. Article 7 of the compact stated, in old and careful legal language, that any confirmed act of violence against a human minor by a member of a signatory species would trigger an automatic, non-negotiable response process. The process did not require approval from any alien government. It did not require a trial conducted by outside parties. It required only two things: clear evidence and confirmation of the victim's status as a human minor. Both of those requirements had already been met. Once the report was processed and verified, it was passed to a division within human governance that few people outside of it ever discussed publicly. This division did not have a dramatic name. It was called simply the Compact Enforcement Office. Its officers were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were mostly quiet professionals, former military officers, retired diplomats, and specialists who had spent years studying how to move through galactic space without drawing attention. Their job was rare but simple. When a compact was broken, they made sure it was addressed, quietly and completely. The officer assigned to review the Corvus Anchor case was a woman named Captain Rosalind Hale, a veteran with almost 30 years of service. She watched the security footage from the quiet step twice, her face unreadable. When it finished the second time, she leaned back in her chair and spoke to the two officers waiting with her. Confirmed assault, confirmed minor, confirmed signatory species, she said. This one is clean, no ambiguity. One of the officers, a younger man named Reyes, nodded. Orders, Captain. Standard protocol, Hale said. We do not go in loud. We do not announce anything to the Council. We collect the offending officer, we deliver her to a Council vessel per the Compact's terms, and we let the Council explain to their own people what happened. This is not our war. This is enforcement. Reyes hesitated. Some of the younger crew think we should send a bigger message, considering it was a child. Hale's expression did not change, but her voice grew quieter. That is exactly why we don't. A bigger message would mean losing control of the message. This species struck a human child because she believed there would be no consequence. We are going to show her, and everyone watching, that there is always a consequence, calm, controlled, certain. That is a stronger message than any show of force could ever be. Reyes nodded, understanding. This was not the first time he had heard Hale explain this philosophy, but it was the first time he had seen it applied to a case involving a child. He found himself agreeing completely. Orders went out that same day, though nothing about them looked urgent to anyone outside the small circle of people involved. A supply ship called the Marner Creek, registered as a simple cargo vessel, altered its flight path slightly to pass near Corvus Anchor. Nobody at the station's traffic control office thought anything of it. Cargo ships changed routes often, chasing better prices or avoiding delays. The Marner Creek was not what it appeared to be, but very few people in the galaxy knew that. At the same time, a message was quietly sent to the Council's central offices, not as an alarm, not as a complaint, but as a simple administrative notice, the kind of document that might sit unread in an inbox for days. It stated, in plain and unemotional language, that a Class 1 violation of the Ardennes Compact had occurred at Corvus Anchor, that the responsible individual had been identified, and that enforcement action was already underway according to standing agreement. The notice reached a low-level council administrator named Furran Ka, who read it with mild confusion. He had never actually seen a Class 1 violation notice before. He checked the archives and found only 2 other examples in the council's entire history, both decades old, both resolved quietly with no diplomatic incident. He assumed this one would be the same. He filed the notice, added it to the weekly briefing packet for the Council's Human Affairs desk, and thought little more about it. He did not realize the briefing packet would not be reviewed for another 5 days, and that by then, the situation would already be finished. Meanwhile, aboard the Quiet Step, Myra was recovering well. The mark on her cheek had faded completely, and she had returned to her usual cheerful self, though she remained a little more cautious around uniformed officers than before. Elena and Marcus tried to keep life as normal as possible, continuing their trade business, preparing cargo for their next destination. Dorian Voss remained close, watching the station with quiet attentiveness, though he said little about what he expected to happen next. On the second night after the incident, Marcus found Dorian standing alone near the observation deck, looking out at the stars. "You filed the report quickly," Marcus said, joining him, "faster than I expected." "There was no reason to wait," Dorian replied. "The evidence was clear. Waiting only allows people to convince themselves that what they saw did not happen the way it happened." "What happens now?" Dorian was quiet for a moment. "Now, people who are very good at their jobs do quiet work that most of the galaxy will never see. The officer who struck your daughter will be collected. She will be brought before council authority, and the compact will be honored. And if the council resists, if they protect her?" "They won't," Dorian said simply. "They signed the compact because they thought it would never truly be tested. Now it will be, and they will discover that we do not make promises we don't intend to keep." Marcus studied the old man's calm profile for a long moment. "You've done this before, haven't you? Not this exact thing, but something like it." Dorian did not answer directly. "I have seen what happens when people believe humanity is soft," he said instead. "It is always a short-lived belief." Far across the station, unaware of any of this, Vexthren slept soundly in her quarters, already having mostly forgotten the child she had struck 3 days earlier. She had no dreams of consequence, no sense that anything was wrong. Her file remained flagged, her fate already moving toward her with quiet, unstoppable patience, carried forward by a system built long ago for exactly this purpose, and now, for the first time in decades, finally being used. To understand why humanity responded the way it did, one had to understand something about human history that most other species in the galaxy had never bothered to learn. Alien scholars who studied Earth usually focused on technology, on the strange speed of human industrial growth, or on the odd patchwork of human governments before they unified. Very few studied the older records, the ones that explained why humans treated harm against children as something separate from all other crimes, something that could not be negotiated, excused, or forgiven through diplomacy. Captain Rosalind Hale understood this history well. She had studied it as part of her early training in the Compact Enforcement Office, back when she was young, and had asked her own instructor why the Ardennes Compact existed at all, when so many other, larger issues faced humanity during its early years among the stars. Her instructor, an old and tired man named Colonel Whitfield, had answered her with a story instead of a lecture. He told her about a period in Earth's history, centuries earlier, when wars had been fought not over land or resources, but over ideas so terrible that entire generations of humans decided together that some lines could never be crossed again. He spoke of camps, of children lost to violence and neglect, of decades spent building laws and protections meant to ensure such things could never happen again without swift and certain consequence. "We are not a perfect species," Whitfield had told her. "We have done terrible things to each other throughout our history, but somewhere along the way, we decided that our children were the one thing we would protect absolutely, without exception, without excuse. It became part of who we are, so deeply that even now, centuries later among the stars, meeting species who have never known war on the scale we have, we still carry that promise with us. It is not written in our laws because we are gentle. It is written in our laws because we know exactly what happens when that promise is broken, and we have decided forever never to allow it again." Hale had never forgotten those words. She thought of them now, watching updates come in about the Marner Creek's slow, unremarkable approach to Corvus Anchor. Aboard the Council's central offices, far from the quiet human preparations, the mood remained calm and unaware. Furun Ka's briefing packet sat unread for several days, exactly as expected. The Council itself, a rotating body of representatives from the galaxy's major species, spent its time on larger matters: trade disputes between two mining conglomerates, a border disagreement between two non-human systems, and a proposal to expand shipping lanes near a resource-rich asteroid belt. Human affairs rarely made the agenda at all, since humanity was still considered a minor player in galactic politics, useful for trade but not yet powerful enough to demand serious attention. This perception was about to change. On the fourth day after the incident, a human ambassador named Sarah Chen requested an emergency meeting with the Council's diplomatic committee. This alone was unusual, since human ambassadors rarely requested emergency meetings for anything. Humanity's diplomatic style had always been slow, careful, and formal, preferring scheduled talks over sudden demands. The committee, mildly curious, granted the meeting. Chen arrived alone, dressed simply, carrying no assistance and no visible anger. She sat across from the three council representatives assigned to hear her, a Skarn elder named Threl Vash, a Genorian trade official named Bex Umra, and a quiet Talrashi observer whose name few bothered to remember. Chen placed a single data drive on the table between them. 5 days ago, she said, her voice calm and even, an officer of the Skarn Enforcement Corps struck a human child during a routine cargo inspection at Corvus Anchor. The child was 8 years old. The assault is fully documented on this drive, along with witness statements and station security footage. Threl Vash, the Skarn elder, frowned deeply. This is a serious accusation. If true, it will be investigated through proper channels, and the officer will face discipline according to Skarn law. That will not be necessary, Chen said. The matter is already being handled under the terms of the Ardennes Compact, Article 7, which your government signed 43 years ago. I am not here to request an investigation. I am here as a formal courtesy, to inform the council that enforcement is already underway. The room went quiet. Bex Umra, the Gainorian official, leaned forward. I am not familiar with this compact. What does enforcement under it involve? The compact allows human authorities to collect the offending individual directly, without requiring extradition proceedings, when the victim is a confirmed human minor and evidence is conclusive, Chen said. Both conditions have been met. The officer in question will be taken into human custody and returned to council jurisdiction for whatever consequence your own laws require. We are not here to punish her ourselves. We are here to ensure she faces judgment, one way or another. Threl Vash's frown deepened further. This compact grants your species the right to seize one of our officers from our own territory without our approval. It does, Chen said simply. You signed it. At the time, your government believed it would never be relevant since so few humans traveled far from our territories, and violence against human children by outside parties was considered unlikely. That assumption has now proven false. This is highly irregular, Bex Umra said, though his tone carried more curiosity than alarm. Surely this can be resolved through standard diplomatic negotiation, rather than unilateral action. It could be, Chen said. But it will not be because the compact does not require negotiation. It requires only confirmation, which has already occurred. I am here today not to ask permission, but to extend the same courtesy your government would expect from us, notice before action, rather than after. The Talrashi observer, who had said nothing until now, finally spoke, her voice soft and thoughtful. You are telling us this has already begun? Yes, Chen said. And there is nothing we can do to stop it. No, Chen said. There is not. But I would encourage the council to consider what this moment represents, not as an act of aggression, but as a demonstration of how seriously humanity treats its own promises, and how seriously we expect others to treat theirs. She stood, collected her single data drive, and left the room without further discussion, leaving the three representatives in stunned silence. News of the meeting spread quickly through council offices, no longer able to remain a quiet administrative matter. Furun Ka, hearing the rumors, finally opened the briefing packet he had set aside days earlier and found the notice he had barely glanced at before. He read it fully this time, his hands growing unsteady as he understood what it actually meant. Vexthren's superior, a Skarn commander named Dresk Orlin, received an urgent call that evening, informing him that one of his junior officers was the subject of a Class 1 Ardennes compact violation. He listened to the explanation twice, certain at first that it was some kind of mistake or exaggeration. When he finally understood it was neither, he sat in silence for a long moment before ordering Vexthren's file pulled and reviewed in full detail. He watched the security footage from Corvus Anchor alone in his office, late at night. He watched the child reach toward the scanning device. He watched Vexthren strike her without hesitation. He watched the human father step forward, calm and silent, and the older man speak quietly before the family walked away. Dresk Orlin had served in the Skarn military for over 30 years. He had fought in 3 border conflicts and had seen violence of every kind. But something about the footage unsettled him more than any battle he had witnessed, perhaps because of how small and one-sided it was, or perhaps because of the calm, controlled reaction of the humans afterward, a reaction that felt less like restraint and more like patience, the kind of patience that came before something far worse. He tried to reach Vexthren directly that night, intending to warn her, to prepare her somehow for what was coming. Her calm went unanswered. He told himself she was simply asleep, unaware, as she had been for days, that the quiet machinery of an old promise had already been set in motion around her, and that no warning he could give would arrive in time to change anything now. Far above Corvus Anchor, the Marner Creek completed its final approach, its unremarkable cargo ship exterior giving no hint of what waited inside. Captain Hale reviewed the final details of the operation one last time, her expression calm, her voice steady as she gave the order to proceed. "Begin collection," she said. And quietly, without alarm, without announcement, the next phase began. Corvus Anchor's security systems were considered reliable by galactic standards. The station used scanning arrays purchased from 3 different manufacturers, cross-checked against each other to prevent smuggling, unauthorized boarding, or any kind of security breach. Station Director Yolam Barrick took pride in the fact that in 11 years of operation, no unauthorized vessel had ever docked without detection. That record ended quietly, without anyone noticing, on the morning the Marner Creek arrived. The ship had registered as a standard cargo hauler, carrying agricultural equipment bound for a colony 3 systems away. Its paperwork was clean, its transponder signal ordinary, its captain listed as a man named Foster Grant, a name that existed in shipping records going back 9 years, complete with prior manifests, fuel purchases, and docking histories at a dozen different stations. Nothing about the ship raised any flags. This was, of course, exactly the point. What station security did not know, and had no way of knowing, was that the Marner Creek was one of a small number of vessels operated by the Compact Enforcement Office, built and maintained for exactly this kind of task. Its cargo holds contained agricultural equipment, because the mission required a real, verifiable cover, but hidden beneath the false decking of its lower levels sat a small team of 6 enforcement officers, along with equipment designed specifically to move through station security without triggering any alarm. Reyes, the young officer who had spoken with Hale days earlier, sat now in the ship's cramped lower compartment, checking his gear one final time. Beside him sat 4 other officers, quiet and focused, along with a specialist named Akafer, whose job was to handle the station's internal systems from the inside once they were aboard. "Remember," Hale said over the comm from the ship's small command area above them, "no weapons drawn unless there is direct resistance. This is a collection, not an assault. We move in, we identify the subject, we take her into custody, and we leave, clean and quiet." "Copy that," Reyes said. The Marner Creek docked at Bay 6, several bays down from where the quiet step still sat. Its arrival triggered no alerts, no unusual attention. A dock worker briefly checked its manifest, confirmed the agricultural cargo listed, and waved it through standard processing. Foster Grant, or rather the officer using that identity, exchanged a few friendly words with the worker about delivery schedules before heading back toward his ship, giving no indication that anything unusual was underway. Inside the station, Akafer connected a small device to an access panel near the docking bay, a device that did not hack or break through the station's security systems in any dramatic way, but instead quietly borrowed access already granted to legitimate maintenance crews, blending in rather than breaking in. Within minutes, he had a clear view of the station's internal camera network and personnel tracking systems, invisible to anyone monitoring those same systems from the station's own security office. "I have her," Akafer said quietly. "Vex Thren currently on duty, Inspection Bay 14, alone processing a cargo shipment from a Talrashi trade vessel." Hale nodded, watching the feed herself now from the command area. "Good. Reyes, take your team. Quiet approach, minimal contact with other personnel. I want this done before her shift ends." Reyes and 3 other officers moved through the station's service corridors, dressed in the plain, unremarkable uniforms of station maintenance workers, complete with tool belts and identification badges cloned from real station employees currently off duty. Nobody looked at them twice. This was, after all, the entire strategy, not stealth in the traditional sense, but simple, boring invisibility, the kind that worked because nobody expected anything unusual from people who looked like they belonged. They reached Inspection Bay 14 just as Vex Thren finished scanning the last crate of the Talrashi shipment. She looked up, mildly annoyed. as 4 maintenance workers entered her bay without announcement. "This area is restricted during inspection," she said irritably. "Come back after my shift." Reyes stepped forward, his expression calm. "Officer Vex Thren, you are being taken into custody under the authority of the Ardennes Compact, Article 7, for the assault of a human minor on this station, 5 days ago." For a moment Vex Thren simply stared at him, uncomprehending. Then she laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "You are human. You have no authority here. This is Council territory and I am a Skarn officer. You cannot simply—" "The Compact grants us that exact authority," Reyes said, still calm. "Your own government agreed to these terms 43 years ago. I would encourage you to come without resistance. This does not need to be difficult." Vex Thren's hand moved instinctively toward the sidearm at her belt, more from surprise than intention. But before she had covered half the distance, one of the officers beside Reyes, a woman named Tors, closed the gap between them with startling speed and calm efficiency, securing Vex Thren's arm before the weapon could be drawn. There was no violence in the movement, no anger, only precise, practiced control, the kind that came from officers who had trained for exactly this moment for years without ever expecting to use it. Vex Thren struggled briefly, more out of shock than any real hope of escape, before realizing the futility of it. She stared at Reyes, her earlier confidence replaced by something closer to fear. "You cannot do this," she said again, though her voice had lost its certainty. "The Council will not allow this. My government will not allow this." "Your government has already been notified," Reyes said. "This was not a secret operation. We informed the Council 4 days ago, through proper channels, exactly as the Compact requires. This is not an attack on your people, officer. This is the process your own leaders agreed to, being carried out exactly as written." Vex Thren said nothing further as the officers guided her out of the inspection bay, through the same quiet service corridors they had used to enter, drawing no attention from the handful of station personnel they passed. The entire operation, from the moment Reyes and his team entered Bay 14 to the moment they returned to the Marner Creek with Vex Thren in custody, took less than 11 minutes. Station Director Yolam Barrick did not learn what had happened until nearly 2 hours later, when a Skarn official on the station finally noticed Vex Thren had missed a scheduled check-in and initiated an inquiry. By then, the Marner Creek had already undocked, its departure logged as routine, its true purpose still completely unknown to Corvus Anchor's security systems. Barrick reviewed what footage he could find, growing increasingly alarmed as he realized an armed officer had been removed from his station by individuals posing as maintenance workers, individuals his own security systems had never flagged as suspicious. He immediately contacted Council authorities, only to be informed, to his shock, that the Council had already been aware of the situation for days and had chosen not to intervene, bound by the same compact that had authorized the collection in the first place. "You knew this was happening," Barrick said, disbelief clear in his voice, "and you told no one on my station." "The compact does not require station notification," came the reply. "Only Council notification, which was provided in accordance with proper procedure." Barrick had no response to that. He simply sat in his office, staring at the footage of 4 ordinary-looking maintenance workers walking calmly through his station, carrying out an operation so quiet and controlled that not a single alarm had been triggered from start to finish. Aboard the Marner Creek, now well clear of Corvus Anchor and moving toward its next destination, Vex Thren sat in a small holding compartment, still struggling to understand what had happened to her. She had expected shouting, violence, perhaps even an attempt at rescue by her own people. Instead, she found herself surrounded by calm, professional silence, officers who spoke to her only when necessary, who offered her food and water without hostility, who treated the entire situation as routine procedure rather than punishment. This unsettled her more than anger would have. "You are not going to hurt me?" she finally asked Tors, who stood watch near the compartment entrance. "No," Tors said simply. "That is not our purpose." "Then what is your purpose?" Tors considered the question for a moment before answering. "To make sure people understand that some promises are not negotiable. What happens to you next is not up to us. It is up to your own government and the compact your government signed. We are simply making sure you arrive there." Vex Thren said nothing more for the rest of the journey, staring instead at the floor of her small compartment, replaying the moment in the cargo bay days earlier again and again, trying to understand how such a small, careless action had led her here, and beginning, for the first time, to feel something closer to genuine fear about what still lay ahead. Far ahead of the Marner Creek, at the edge of Council-controlled space, a massive vessel waited in slow orbit, its hull marked with the emblem of the Interspecies Council itself. It was there, aboard that ship, that Captain Hale intended to complete the final part of her mission, delivering not just an offending officer, but a message the entire Council would not soon forget. The Council's flagship, known simply as Threshold, was the largest vessel most species in the galaxy had ever seen up close, a floating city of diplomacy and authority that had hosted treaties, trials, and ceremonies for over 2 centuries. It was here that representatives from every signatory species gathered for matters too significant for smaller offices to handle. It was here that the Marner Creek now approached, its arrival this time not hidden, but announced clearly and formally through proper channels, exactly as the compact required for this final stage. Word had already spread through Threshold by the time the small ship docked. The council session that day had been called specially, at the request of human ambassador Sarah Chen, who had returned from her earlier meeting with new instructions and a simple request that the full council be present to receive the conclusion of the Ardennes Compact proceeding regarding Corvus Anchor. Representatives filled the great chamber, dozens of species seated in tiered rows around a central floor, murmuring quietly among themselves. Most had only heard second-hand accounts of what had happened, fragments of rumor mixed with confusion about a compact few of them had ever taken seriously. Threll Vosh sat near the front, his expression grim, having spent the past several days in tense communication with his own government, trying and failing to find any legal path to intervene. Dresk Orlin, Vex Thren's commanding officer, had traveled to Threshold himself, standing now near the Skarn delegation, his face carrying the weight of a man who had already accepted that nothing he said today would change what was coming. Captain Hale entered the chamber alone, dressed simply, carrying no weapon, no visible escort. She walked to the center of the floor with the same unhurried calm that had defined every step of the operation, and stopped before the raised platform where the council's rotating chair, a Ganorian elder named Bex Umra, waited with visible unease. "Captain Hale," Umra said, "you have requested this session to conclude the matter of Officer Vex Thren." "I have," Hale said. "Then please proceed." Hale reached into a small case she carried and withdrew a single data drive, setting it on a small table before the platform. This drive contains the full record of the incident, the investigation, and the collection. It also contains Officer Vex Thren's own recorded statement, given voluntarily during transit, in which she confirms the events as documented. She paused. "I present this not because the Council required convincing. The compact does not require council approval to act. I present it so there can be no confusion later about what occurred or why." Threll Vosh rose from his seat. "And the officer herself, where is she? If she is to face judgment, she should face it before this council, not simply be delivered like cargo." "She already has faced judgment," Hale said quietly. The chamber fell silent. "I do not understand," Umra said slowly. "The Ardennes Compact was written with a clear intention," Hale said. "Not to humiliate, not to punish beyond what was necessary, but to ensure absolute certainty that harm against a human child would never go unanswered. When your government signed it, they agreed that in cases of confirmed, undeniable violence against a human minor, verified through evidence beyond dispute, the matter would be resolved swiftly and without prolonged proceeding. Officer Vexthren's guilt was never in question. She confirmed it herself on record, without coercion. She reached again into the case. What she placed on the table before the platform silenced the entire chamber more completely than anything spoken that day. It was not presented with theater or cruelty, but simply and formally, the final piece of evidence in a proceeding already concluded, treated with the same quiet gravity as everything else humanity had done throughout the affair. Dresk Orlin did not move. He had known, somewhere in the days since he first watched that security footage alone in his office, that this moment might come. He had told himself it would not, that no species could truly carry out something so final over what his own culture would have considered a minor disciplinary matter. He understood now, watching the chamber's stunned silence, how badly he had misjudged the promise humanity had made and kept for over 40 years without ever being tested. "This is barbaric," Threl Vosh finally said, his voice shaking. "You executed her without a formal trial, without—" "She was tried," Hale said calmly, "under the exact terms your own government agreed to. The compact does not describe a courtroom proceeding because it was never meant to require one. It describes evidence, confirmation, and consequence. All three conditions were met, exactly as written, exactly as your leaders understood when they signed their names to it. If your government believed this compact would never truly be enforced, that was a mistake made 43 years ago, not a violation committed today." "A child was struck," Umra said slowly, seeming to search for understanding rather than argument. "A serious offense, certainly, but this response seems disproportionate to many of us." "I understand why it may seem that way," Hale said, and for the first time, something softer entered her voice, not weakness, but something closer to sorrow. "Let me try to explain, not as a threat, but as truth. Humanity has fought wars against itself for most of its history. We have done terrible things to one another, more terrible in some ways than anything most species in this chamber have done to each other. Somewhere in the aftermath of our worst chapters, we made a promise, not written in any single law but carried in nearly every human culture across our world, that our children would be protected absolutely, without exception, without negotiation. It became the one line none of us, no matter our disagreements, would ever allow to be crossed again." She looked around the chamber slowly, meeting the eyes of representatives from a dozen different species. "When we joined this council, we asked for very little. We did not demand territory or power. We asked only that this one promise be honored by those we chose to trust. Your government agreed, believing, I think, that it was a symbolic gesture, a small concession to a minor species eager to prove itself important. You did not understand that we meant it exactly as written. That was your error, not ours." Nobody in the chamber spoke. "I want to be clear," Hale continued. "This was not an act of war. Humanity has no interest in conflict with your people or with any species represented in this chamber today. We do not seek to punish your government, your military, or your citizens for the actions of one officer who made a terrible choice. What happened here was law, enforced exactly as agreed, nothing more and nothing less. If your council wishes to review the compact, to renegotiate its terms, we will listen, as we always have. But we will not apologize for keeping a promise your own leaders asked us to make." She picked up the data drive from the table, leaving the rest of the proceedings' conclusion where it lay, and turned to walk back toward the chamber doors. "Captain Hale," Umra called after her, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. "Do you understand what this will mean? How this will be seen by the wider galaxy?" Hale paused at the doorway and looked back. "I understand it will be seen many ways by many species. Some will call it justice. Some will call it cruelty. I only ask that everyone in this chamber remember one thing clearly. We did not act in secret. We gave notice. We followed exactly the terms your own governments agreed to, decades before any of us were born into these roles. If this outcome troubles you, I would encourage you to ask not why humanity enforced its promise, but why anyone believed we would not. She left the chamber without waiting for a response, walking calmly back through the halls of Threshold toward the waiting Marner Creek, her expression giving away nothing of what she felt inside. She had done this kind of work only twice before in her long career, and both times, she had returned to her quarters afterward and sat alone for a long while before speaking to anyone. Today would likely be no different. Far away, aboard the quiet step, still docked at Corvus Anchor, Myra sat on the small couch in the family's living quarters, drawing pictures with a set of colored markers her mother had bought her from a station shop. She hummed quietly to herself, the mark on her cheek long since faded, the memory of the incident already fading too, the way memories often did for children who were loved and protected well. She did not know that her name now existed in old records tied to one of the only true tests of the Ardennes Compact in its entire history. She did not know that a council chamber, filled with representatives of a dozen powerful species, had spent an afternoon in stunned silence because of what had happened to her days earlier. She knew only that her parents seemed a little more relaxed than they had been in recent days, that her father had hugged her a bit longer than usual that morning, and that Dorian, the quiet old man who traveled with them, had smiled at her gently over breakfast in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "Are we safe now?" she had asked him. "You were always safe," Dorian had told her. "We simply made sure everyone else understood that too." Myra, satisfied with that answer, returned to her drawing, humming softly, unaware of the galactic ripple caused quietly in her name, content simply to be home, surrounded by a family that had asked for nothing more than the promise they had been given, kept.